the estimate of how many slaves were actually brought here from Africa. 388,000. In 1860, we see the colored population is at 4.4 million. Slave birth rates in the 19th century were very high, near a biological maximum for a human population. Kurimeo Ahau. Its entire objective is to make an amendment to Senate Bill 3019. Shalosio Yatzareo. It's your brother, your cousin, your nephew, young Unehiya, reporting live on behalf of the master of breath, Hisaketu Mesi. Listen, if you are somebody who watches Kurimeo Ahau, if you know that channel and you know its content, you are the type of person on whom this video will not be wasted. You will understand the significance of what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Unehiya. Unehiya is an organization that advocates for Black Indians. They're in the middle of waging a political campaign right now. Its entire objective is to make an amendment to Senate Bill 3019. I've done a video already about that, and I want you to be able to check out this video if you have a chance. I want you to check out that video so that you can see the breakdown of what that bill is about and what's significant about it right now for us. But I'm going to give you the long and short. The gist of it is this. This is an organization that needs support for amending that bill because this is a way to get acknowledgement and recognition from the federal government of who we are. This is not something that comes with reservations and a check and all of that. No, we're not talking about getting a check. We're not even talking about getting land. This campaign is organized specifically for the focus of getting recognition for not only Indian freedmen, but we're talking about Black Indians who were never enslaved as well. I was a journalist for 7 years, and politics was my primary beat. I covered government at the state and municipal level as well as the federal level. I've seen how grassroots activism can actually impact the way a bill passes when it has not yet passed. This is a bill that has not yet passed. It can be amended before it passes, and that's what they're trying to do. If it is amended, then the changes are going to result in a change in educational curriculum as well as research resources in such a way that they begin to reflect the Negro Indian origins of indigenous people throughout the Americas. I want you to see the video that I mentioned a minute ago because there's a lot more to it than that. Right now, what everybody is fighting for and what Kurimeo Ahau talks about all the time is recognition of the truth. That's what this is about. For Unehiya to get the support that it needs members. It needs a member base, and it needs you guys to be able to give whatever monetary support you're able to give. It may be small donations. If you can become a member, then that there comes a monetary support with that as well. And they need that because this campaign is costly. Any successful campaign to do something like this does cost money. And so there is going to be a need for people who are able to support a worthy cause. It's a time for us as a people to come together, put differences aside. We don't all agree perfectly on what our history is, and I understand that, but you got to put that aside and really think, do you or do you not want the real acknowledgement of who we are to come to fruition, because it can be done and there's ways to demonstrate it, but there's a lot of data that needs to be put in front of the right people. So that's what we need. And we also need a petition to be signed. So if you can sign that petition and become a member and be able to contribute to the movement, that's what Unehiya needs right now, and I'm doing my part as best I can to find the people who are willing to do that, because it doesn't really take that much of your time. Act now. Just as a quick recap, I want to show you guys how many slaves genuinely were brought to the North American mainland from Africa. Again, I've said before, this is not a channel where we just act like nobody was brought here from Africa. We just want to have a realistic understanding of how many people that actually was, right? So I'm showing you the Virginia Encyclopedia. I'm showing you an entry from the Virginia Encyclopedia, and it's showing, and the reason I'm showing you this is because it's giving you a range, the estimate of how many slaves were actually brought here from Africa, right? And that range spans from 374,000 to 388,000. Now, why does it matter that we're looking at the Virginia Encyclopedia? First of all, I keep showing y'all this on this channel from different sources. I want to show you different sources. In the video that I keep telling you about, which you need to go watch, you need to go watch that video where I break down what this bill is that I was talking about a minute ago, Senate Bill 3019. What I'm saying is I can give you multiple verifiable, trustworthy sources. What's important about these sources is that they are sources that the government agrees with. Why does that matter? Because these are things we can actually take to them directly and say, hey, you agree with us that this is how many people actually came here from Africa. Virginia Encyclopedia gives a range of 374,000 to 388,000. Slave Voyages database gives a specific number, 388,747. So check this out. When I give you that range, we're talking about how many there were brought from Africa to the North American mainland across the entire slave trade. From the year 1501 forward indefinitely. That's the total number. It's not that big. Okay, so 1860. In 1860, the census of 1860 shows us a population of 4.4 million. Not 1960, 1860, right? In 1860, we see the colored population is at 4.4 million. That's their own story. That's the mainstream narrative. 388,000 at the max. We just seen that from Virginia Encyclopedia. So how is it then that in 1860 you've already got 4.4 million colored people if the total number you had brought up to that point wasn't even 10% of that? We're talking about, I showed you in that video that I keep talking about, I showed you that the number you brought is only 9.8% of the number that's present as of 1860. So how is that possible? How did this population increase tenfold while you were still bringing them? Right? That's the question. Okay. And mind you, that population, that figure, 4.4 million, that's the total number of colored people, both slave and free at the time. And emancipation is a few years out after this census. So emancipation has not happened yet at that time, right? Okay, so that being said, the aim that you're going to get from mainstream scholars, and I'm giving you this so that you can understand what the argument is. When you ask that question, mainstream scholars are going to typically say, well, there was an enormous birth rate for the colored population at that time. And they were able to increase tenfold legitimate just because that's just how many of them, that's just their astronomical birth rate. And that's the explanation. That is the explanation. So in this video, we're going to break down the birth rate. Okay? But keep in mind, everything I'm talking to you about, all of this information is about to be something that we want Congress to grapple with. when having to deal with that bill I mentioned earlier. The answers to the questions we're currently asking are the exact facts and points that we're going to be making in a very detailed electronic delivery to Senator Tina Smith. All right. So there's an actual strategy in place. Unehiya is all on top of that. That's why we need to support Unehiya in doing that. First, we're going to deal with the birth rate. Let's deal with the birth rate. So listen to me. I want to talk about, just for a quick second, I want to talk about spiritual identity. I'm going to do a video about spiritual identity in the future. This video is not about that, so I'm not going to dwell on this at all. In fact, I didn't even want to mention it because I don't want to, because of the fact that I'm trying to keep spirituality out of this video, right? But the reality is, not enough of us who talk about being indigenous, not enough of us delve into the spiritual ramification of claiming our indigenous ancestry. But one thing I do want to point out about spiritual identity is that, in general, from a spiritual perspective, your identity is comprised of 4 generations. Your identity is comprised of 4 generations. And just so you know who's talking to you, I am a Creek Indian, primarily. I am also part Cherokee, as is very common among many of you, right? Right. So yeah, I've got some Cherokee blood going on. I am primarily Creek Indian. I have Creek Indian on both my mother's side and a tiny bit on my father's side as well. So bear that in mind as I'm saying what I'm saying. 4 generations make up your spiritual identity. That means you represent 8 bloodlines. You are the product of 8 bloodlines. And you don't even have to believe what I'm saying. Just check out what the significance of this would be, if you don't mind. If you are indeed the product of 8 bloodlines in particular, then what you have to consider then is this. It's not unthinkable that one of them would have a connection to African ancestry. And for me, that is the case. I have one bloodline out of the 8. I have one bloodline that does connect to the African continent. And I know what a lot of you are thinking. If you are the viewers of Kurimeo's channel, then you're thinking, now, come on now. No, listen. I know the ship. I know the name of the ship. I know the port that the ship that the ship disembarked from. I know the owner's name. I know the seller's name. I know the families of both. I know multiple families in the seller's family. I know multiple people in the seller's family. I know multiple people in the owner's family. Listen. I know this. I've done. My point is this. This is a thing that can happen. And the mindset we've got to abandon is this notion that it's all or nothing. Stop thinking that it's all or nothing. Stop trying to get everybody to agree with you that only one thing happened to any one people ever. Are we more indigenous or are we more African? That's how you need to be thinking about it. When we get into talking about the birth rate of the colored population, using that as an explanation for how the entire 4.4 million colored population as of 1860 could have been a product of just the less than 400,000 slaves brought from Africa to the North American mainland. That is a very unlikely story. But in order for it to be true, the slave breeding part has to be true. Slave breeding is a hugely, massively important part of the narrative, the mainstream narrative. And it has to be more than just true. It has to be the norm across the board for the majority of slaves brought over here in order for us to be African in any large number. In order for us to have any significant component of our ancestry be from Africa, in order for any significant component of our ancestry to really be from Africa, we're going to need this slave breeding explanation to work. And I'm going to show you in a minute why it's so critical, why this is the only way that the mainstream narrative can work. And I'm going to show you what's wrong with it. But first, I want to show you this. You need to accept the fact that there are a lot of actual anecdotes and accounts of slave breeding having happened. So do not just immediately start saying, oh, no, slave breeding didn't happen. And for anybody who's confused about what we're talking about when I say slave breeding, what we mean is white masters impregnating enslaved women to create more slaves because we were experiencing what is called chattel slavery. If the mother is a slave, it is automatically legally the case that her child is a slave as soon as it's born. And that child immediately belongs to her master. That's how chattel slavery works. I've talked about that before. I'll talk about it more in the future, I'm sure. But slave breeding is the industrial production of more slaves by impregnating the enslaved women. And the mainstream narrative we've been fed is that white men would either rape them, or sometimes it wouldn't be rape necessarily, but they would take these women as mistresses. And I have a hard time believing that any of it was ever anything but rape. I just have a hard time with that, because if you're a slave, what choice did you ever have? You could not consent, right? But that's just me. Anyway, that's the narrative. And so a bunch of slaves, they're saying that our population multiplied by a factor of 10, because of how much all the slave owners were doing this with the enslaved women. That's wild. You understand how many more slaves were created here than imported here, right? By the mainstream narrative. And that's what we need to be analyzing. And I just want to say that the reason I brought up my own family is because I do have evidence of slave breeding in my own family. Only one instance, and I have yet to be able to verify if I am a lineal descendant of any person who was a product of that. There's a specific plantation that I'm referring to that my ancestors were on, and they deny that it ever happened. There have been DNA tests done to prove that people who look like me and have my last name, which is the same last name as the family who owned them, by the way, actually did have a common ancestor with white people who have my same last name. And we even have a suspect as to who that common ancestor must be. However, that plantation, the keepers of those grounds, today they continue to deny, no matter what DNA says. They deny that the very military man of a very prominent political family ever did what we're accusing of doing, which is this slave breeding thing. Also, there's reason to suspect that even doing it got him put in the doghouse by his own wife, which brings me to my point. How many white women were just being okay with this incredibly shameful thing happening? There would be enormous stigma to this if this is what was really going on. You understand that, right? But everyone who was owning slaves must have been doing it in order to affect the birth rate of the colored population the way you claim. We're about to get into the numbers to show you why I say that. We're going to look at a 2020 study that I think is going to shed, and it's very recent. It's very recent, right? 2020. We're going to look at a 2020 study that sheds a lot of light on this, done by a mainstream researcher who is considered an expert in his field. Let's take a look. I want to talk about J. David Hacker, Dr. J. David Hacker. This is a guy who's actually a professor at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. This guy, he's a demographic historian, all right? You could also say a demographer, but he's also a historian, okay? So he is a demographer, but his expertise is not in the is not necessarily in the demographics of today. It's not necessary, or in the demography of modern populations. It's in the demography of specifically 19th and 20th century populations. All right, so in 2019, USA Today was doing something special to commemorate the 400th anniversary of slaves being brought to this country from Africa. USA Today came to Dr. Hacker at the University of Minnesota because they wanted to get some context to add to the story, the special story they were doing on this, right? And so they consulted him about how many total slaves ever actually lived in the United States. And he came to the conclusion that, you know what, there's actually not good literature on that. There's not good data on that. We don't actually know. And so he did his own research to come up with an answer for them so that he could put together what the data actually shows. And because he put so much research into that to answer in order to answer their question, the very next year in 2020, he published his research on that subject. And in the process of publishing that and putting it all together, there were some things he ended up having to admit. And so he published it in a very renowned academic journal called Slavery and Abolition. Slavery and Abolition is a British peer-reviewed academic journal, and it is published in London. Currently, the study I'm showing you, that I'm talking about right now, is hosted by the National Institutes of Health, which is not uncommon. It's very common for for medical organizations, as well as institutions concerned with medical science, to be the ones who are very directly involved with the publishing and researching of demographic information. That is demographic information is commonly considered to be health information. So anyway, I want to read you a quote that he put in this research note. Quote, "Slave birth rates in the 19th century were very high, near a biological maximum for a human population." Near a biological maximum for a human population. End quote. Now, the reason he's saying that is because he is looking at all the data. He's having to pull all this data together in order to make sense of the mainstream narrative, right? And he's saying, wow, this is an almost scientifically impossible birth rate, because he knows how many were brought and he knows the time frame for bringing them, and the math is just very challenging to make sense of. And he concedes this in his research note as well, actually. This is why slave breeding takes on a much more important role once you understand that a demographer has to tell you that typically this is not how human populations can even grow. This rate that we're talking about, basically what we're saying is, in order for the mainstream narrative to be true, the colored population, who apparently was brought over here from Africa, and there wasn't a colored population here yet. What he's saying is, they represent the peak of human productive potential. They have done what arguably it's possible that no other human population has done. And that's really the problem. The problem is, he has no alternative. He has no alternative. That's the problem. He and all other researchers on the subject are forced, and have long been forced, to just accept the quote-unquote fact that, well, black people must have done the impossible. So now, therefore, we have to blame the only culprit we have, which is slave breeding. Slave masters must have done unbelievable work on these slaves to get them to reproduce at a rate that could make these numbers work. And speaking of things we don't know, I want to point out another thing, which is that in his research, in this study, in this paper that he has written, that he has published in Slavery and Abolition as of 2020, he uses a term over and over and over. The term is assumed birth rate. Assumed birth rate. Are you following me? He uses this term over and over because the birth rate we're talking about that's so astronomical and so unbelievable and so impossible, it is an assumed birth rate. It is. That's the point. That's part of the problem, is that it's an assumption. Now, we have to go with that assumption, apparently, because of course there's just no alternative for where all these black people came from. They had to have come from Africa, so we just have to believe that somehow the 388,000 max black people brought here from Africa must have swelled to this enormous number of 4.4 million by 1860. Throughout this study, he's actually letting you know that there are several decades in the 1700s and in the 1800s that actually give us numbers that are very difficult to believe. And he says in this paper that there's a large margin for error. There's a large margin for error. I'm going to read one of them to you real quick. He's saying, quote, "Given the large proportion of all slaves who were born or imported after 1750, however, estimates of the number of slaves who lived in the United States are robust to significant errors before 1750. End quote. That's huge. So all the estimates we've got before 1750 are unreliable, is what he's saying. Remember, we're only dealing with like a 350-year span of in the first place. We're talking about from 1619, round up, say 1620, to 1860, right? Well, from 1620 to 1750 is like 80 plus 50, that's 130 years. That's 130 years. 1620 to 1860 would be like 240 years. Or wait, it would be 1620 to 1820. That's 200 plus. That's 240 years. That's 240 years that we're talking about in that span. And within that span, out of that 240 year span, we're really talking about 130 years of it. 130 years, that's half of it. That's half. Half of that time is actually unreliably counted. The estimates we have are incredibly unreliable for half of that time. And keep in mind, we didn't even have a census until 1790. Then he also says, here's another quote, that to really drive the point home, he says, quote, "The most important assumption is the estimated slave birth rate in each decade." Listen, this guy was asked a question by journalists like myself. I know how this goes. We find you because of your expertise. We're looking for somebody to give us population data, and Minnesota, the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, actually has a population studies center. I don't know if I'm saying, I don't know if that's the exact name of it, but they have a population study center. And Dr. Hacker he's one of the experts there. So going to him is a no-brainer for a journalist who's looking for data on a population. They wanted to know you know, man, how many man hours did slaves actually contribute to the labor force of this country as it was getting off the ground? Because the point they're trying to make, I get what they're trying to do. They're trying to make a point that in this story, they want to make sure it's understood that slavery's been a big part of this country's narrative. We need to own up to how much we owe to slave labor. This country was built on the backs of slaves. And in order to make that argument, we need to talk about how many slaves there actually were, how much work they actually put in. Can we put a number to the man hours that they put in? And that's also something that he spends a lot of his time on his study answering that question. How many man hours slaves contributed, right? So he's demonstrating slaves built this country. That's part of the point here. But there's more to it than that, because in the process of asking that question, they need to ask it to the right person, and they find somebody who's at the Population Study Center from the University of Minnesota. Very few universities have a population study center, so this is perfect. Not only did they find an expert at the right institution, they found the right expert at that institution, because he's not just any demographer. He's a demographer who is a demography historian, and he specializes in 1800s and 1900s demography. Here's another point that Dr. Hacker makes. Dr. Hacker talks about the fact that in the Chesapeake Bay region, or in the Chesapeake region period, child-to-woman ratios leap wildly from the 1660s to the 1780s. So for a pretty long period of time, we're gonna say roughly, let's say 80 plus 40. That's 120 years. For about 120 years, big swath of time, child to woman ratio are leaping wildly. And you don't even have that much African slave activity in North America until the 1700s. Yet we're starting with this problem of child to woman ratios leaping wildly beginning in the 1660s. Before slaves were even being brought in any significant numbers from Africa to North America at all. It seems as though the Chesapeake region, where you have the Virginia colony, is seeing a bunch of female slaves having enormous numbers of children. Wild figures. And it's important what we see in the Chesapeake region, because for the same reason why I made sure at the beginning of this video to give you the Virginia Encyclopedia as a source for how many slaves were brought here from Africa to mainland North America. The reason it matters so much is because you've only got two main ports of entry into mainland North America for bringing slaves: Louisiana colony and Virginia colony. I want to pivot to Dr. Sarah McNeil, Dr. Sarah G. McNeil at the University of Houston. She's a historian also, and she has a digital history platform that she engineered for the university. It's kind of dated now, but it's functional, and it has on it many cool resources that are very interesting, and one of them is the slavery fact sheet. It gives us this little breakdown of the slaves taken from Africa to let us know that 14% of the slaves brought from Africa were kids under the age of 14. And then 56% of the slaves brought from Africa were adult men. Only 30% of the slaves brought from Africa were adult women. Slightly less than a third. What's crazy about that is the fact that we just went over all this information from another expert explaining how the people brought here from Africa, their population somehow pushed the biological maximum for what they should be expected to do in terms of production, creating offspring. Dr. Hacker says a population of that size, let's say they had a normal balance, a normal ratio of male to female, it is already pushing the biological maximum for them to then swell to a number of 4.4 million in like 250 years. He's saying that's just crazy. And then we have this other expert who's saying, well, if you want to make it even crazier, guess what? They didn't even have enough women to pull that off. Now, we don't know how many of the kids who were under age 14 were female. We don't know what the ratio of male to female was for the kids. No way of knowing. Let's say split it in half, right? Let's say 7% of them, and I doubt this is the case. I imagine that it was more lopsided and that it was actually largely male. But let's say split it in half and say 7% of all the slaves brought from Africa were young girls. 7%. And we'll add that to the 30. That makes 37%. 37% of all the slaves brought from Africa were young girls. It doesn't really do enough to fix our problem. We need a very healthy ratio of men to women here in order to get the absolute best reproductivity out of this population. So when we talk about slave breeding, and again, we don't have anything more than anecdotal evidence of slave breeding happening. We know it happened because there are slave narratives that tell the tale, but we don't have numbers. There's not hard data on that. That's what we need. So I want you to get that and understand there is an alternative. The alternative is that these 4.4 million coloreds are mostly Indians, right? I do want everybody who's watching this to support Unehiya, as I already told you. I want you guys to be able to support Unehiya, because if you can support them with membership and support them because here's the thing, even as a member, yes, that provides some financial support a little bit, but also if they can get more members, they can get more people to do certain things. And one thing that we need is for people who have actually done some of their genealogical research and they've been able to actually find that evidence. If you've been able to find that connection of lineal descent, in fact, honestly, it doesn't even have to be lineal descent. I know that a lot of the tribes, a lot of the nations, the native nations today, a lot of them require lineal descent, or they're not going to count it, as if somehow you wouldn't be Indian, but your aunt would be, like, whatever. But anyway, the point is, if you have genealogical research that can demonstrate that you are in fact Indian, but you look like me, and people point at you and call you an African American, it would be good for them if you could kind of tell your story, just about your genealogical research, the research you've done and what you've found. They're not going to grill you on your records and stuff. And they're not going to require you to give out a bunch of names of living relatives or anything like that. They're not going to do any of that. They're not going to go through any of that with you. But they would like to get your story, because the more people we have to give their story, the better it's going to be, because there needs to be some actual testimonies from people. And some of you may not have found any evidence at all, but you just want to support, and that's perfectly fine. Please do that. Please support. Use the QR code and head to Unehiya and become a member as quickly as possible. We need you to become a member. We need you to become a member when they address Congress. Again, I know how this works. I know what they're trying to do, and I can assure you it's worth doing. And don't be one of those ones who just sits on the sideline because you're so cynical that you just don't believe that it's worthwhile to do any of this, because that doesn't make any sense. You want to watch videos like this, but you don't want to take any action. That doesn't make any sense. You got to actually do something, and there is something you can do. So this is what I'm talking about. Listen, Unehiya, they need bodies, they need members, and they need dollars, and they need signatures on their petition. So to become a member, there's two levels of membership. One of them is like $7 or it's like $6-7, and then there's another level of membership that's like $20. And that level comes with some obligations and some expectation that you're going to sit in on actual meetings. You're going to become like a kind of a stakeholder for Unehiya, and so they want to really you would kind of become one of the decision makers with that. Anybody who's able to do that, please do. But if you can at least, if becoming a member at all, even at the $6-7 level, whatever that is still a big help, and your membership is still a big help. But there's also, I'm gonna leave a link in the description for their fundraising campaign as well, for anyone who's willing to donate more than that. More than those figures, more than $6 or $7, more than $20. If you're able to donate to this cause, this campaign, then you'll be doing them a huge service. We all have to just do what we're able to do. For those of you who are able to afford it, you have the money and the time to be a more involved member and maybe even a decision maker with Unehiya. Please do that as well. Help steer the ship, because they're looking for people who are informed, willing to be at the helm. Point your phone camera at it. Tap the link. It'll take you into your browser right to the page. Do what you gotta do. It'll be super easy. Actually, I got links in the description for all this stuff that I talked about. But the most important link in the description, the most important link is for actually doing something, which is to make a contribution. I am grateful to the Master of Breath. Hisakete Messi. I am grateful that the ancestors have brought us together to kind of come to this realization at the time that we have in the information age. We don't have to agree on every little thing to make solid moves, all right? We can make moves even if we disagree. Let's just try and make sure that even if we're not exactly on the same page, let's make sure we're active. Let's be active. Let's be about that action.